When I am working with clients, fantasy is far and away the genre of fiction that I am most hired on to edit. And I'm never going to complain about that either, because I love editing fantasy, and I love writing fantasy. And I think the reason that I get fantasy manuscripts submitted so often is because fantasy, while being very fun to create, is incredibly difficult to edit. Why do I say that? Well, think of it like this. For a story in a more traditional, realistic setting, a writer can center much of their focus on just the construction of a narrative. This is because the setting, types of characters, and limitations of a more traditional, realistic world are already generally familiar to the audience. In a fantasy setting, though, a writer would need to describe the possible different races, magics, rules, countries and kingdoms, wildlife, environments, histories, and a dozen other things. Oh, and let's not forget, create a narrative streamlined enough to deliver all of that information smoothly while also still being engaging. Editing fantasy is like editing a novel, a history book, and a science book all at once. However, if any of you watching are interested in sharpening your own editing skills when it comes to fantasy, or are just interested in honing your critical eye of storytelling, I hope I can help you out today. I want to use one of my favorite movies of the last decade to give some advice on what pitfalls to avoid when writing/editing fantasy. And if you saw the thumbnail, you know this movie is Aquaman, one of the worst superhero movies since Ghost Rider. Okay, maybe not worse than Green Lantern, but you get the gist. Now, I already hear two big questions popping up. Number one being, can I even trust your opinion as an editor if you like Aquaman? And that's a fantastic question. And the answer to that question would be yes, because the important part is that I recognize that Aquaman is a garbage movie. As I said long ago in my How to Train Your Dragon video that I still get rage comments on, a movie can be bad and you can still like it. There's just something about Jason Momoa's weapons-grade charisma, the gorgeous underwater setting, Black Manta's disturbingly comical plastic Power Ranger suit, and I don't know, maybe the most epic battle in cinema since Helm's Deep that gets me all hot and bothered for the film. Aquaman is just big dumb fun, and it knows it, and that's the type of movie that I can get behind. The second question that is probably coming up is, why are we looking at Aquaman if we are talking about fantasy? Well, because while not specifically fantasy, Aquaman shares a host of analogies with traditional fantasy narratives. For all intents and purposes, I consider the Fisherman Kingdom to be elves, the Brine to be dwarves, the Trench to be the orcs of Mordor, and the Atlanteans to be ambitious mankind. There are histories and lore and kingdoms and powers and all of the associated difficulties of writing fantasy included in the film. The only caveat is that Aquaman sucks at executing almost all of them. And again, that is the exact reason why we are going to break the movie down, specifically by looking at the dialogue. By showing you exactly what you shouldn't do, hopefully you all can gain a better sense of how to properly go about writing and editing in a fantasy setting. So the game plan will be a bit different than my other dialogue dives. For today's video, we will actually be taking a look at two different scenes within the movie, both from within the first 30 minutes. I had to restrain myself to just that, or this video would have been well over an hour. The first aspect that we will be looking at will focus on exposition, specifically info dumping, which is by and large the number one weakness that I see in fantasy manuscripts submitted to me for editing. For those of you not familiar with the term, info dumping is when a narrative unloads a large amount of plot relevant information all at once onto the audience. We will get into why this is bad after we watch the clip, but to put what you're about to watch into perspective, each time a character goes into a lengthy sentence of exposition, I will put it on screen. This might help you visualize just how clunky and cluttered the Aquaman dialogue is. Buckle up because this is a beefy scene. Let's watch.
In Atlan's time, 7 kingdoms were one. Our ancestors gathered here. Atlantis sat here at the head of the table. Zebul was always by his side. Brine, fishermen, the deserters and Trench had not yet fallen. The lost nation had not yet vanished. Together, they were the greatest empire the world had ever seen. And now, set on Atlan's throne, shackled by archaic laws and politics.
By law, you need 4 of the 7 kingdoms to send an attack. The lost nation and the deserters have long perished. The Trench are nothing but animals. The Brine will never join you, and the fishermen are cowards. Once you've obtained the pledge of the 4 kingdoms, you will be ordained Ocean Master. As Ocean Master, you'll be commander of the greatest military might on this planet. What about the rumors that there's another? An Atlantean living among the surface. One of royal blood. You may sit on the throne of Atlantis, but your claim to it is weak. How can you possibly hope to unite the Empire?
My mother's bastard has never even been to Atlantis. His loyalty is to the sun.
So hopefully you can see what I was talking about when I said the scene was clunky and cluttered. Before we dive into how massively wrong all of this was, I feel like we first need to get on the same page on what the function of dialogue is. For the most part, dialogue, with some very Tarantino-esque exceptions, is never meant to be just two characters throwing words at each other. Dialogue is always meant to convey information that is relevant to the narrative. How that relevancy takes form could be establishing setting, character details, rules of the world, or even just the tone of a scene. Now, when considering the scene we just watched from an editing perspective, my mind immediately goes to finding out the function of the dialogue. What message or information is this dialogue between Orm and Nereus trying to convey to me? Well, if we were dealing with a scene containing very subtle writing, double entendres, or subtext, pinning down that function might be difficult. Luckily for us, this scene really puts the B in subtle and is about as nuanced as a crowbar to the face. The dialogue here is very obviously telling us King Orm's motivations.
Now, sit on Atlan's throne, shackled by archaic laws and politics, while the threat above us grows undeniable.
And the prerequisites to achieve his goals.
Once you've obtained the pledge of the four kingdoms, you will be ordained Ocean Master.
That by itself would be all fine and dandy too, but unfortunately for the film, good dialogue is always multifunctional, meaning it always serves two purposes. The first purpose is what we discussed earlier, to convey plot-relevant information to the audience. We can call this the dialogue's external function because it concerns the audience, who exist outside of the narrative. The second purpose of dialogue is to be consistent with what is occurring in-universe. This is the dialogue's internal function. Basically, internal functionality is all about whether or not it makes sense for the characters to say what they're saying. I think some examples would make things more clear too. Let's take a look at Katana's introduction in Suicide Squad.
I would advise not getting killed by her. Her sword traps the souls of its victims.
This is an example of dialogue's external function being fulfilled, but not its internal function. Why? Because the audience is given plot-relevant information, which is the external function. However, it makes no sense in-universe for Rick Flag to say,
I would advise not getting killed by her,
because no one wants to be killed in the first place. The only reason he says this line is so that exposition could be forced onto the audience. Conversely, let's take a look at another amazingly bad movie, The Room.
I got the results of the test back. I definitely have breast cancer.
So this is an example of dialogue's internal function being fulfilled, but not its external function. Why? Well, in universe, this is totally something that a mother would say to her daughter. Maybe not so casually, but this is a reasonable exchange of dialogue to expect from those two characters based on their relationship. However, this information has absolutely nothing to do with the plot. The cancer never comes up again and never impacts the conflict of the narrative. This dialogue has no external function. It doesn't provide the audience with any useful, relevant material. So, with all of that out the way, let's get back to Aquaman and why the scene between Nereus and Orm was so poorly written. If we take a close look at all of the different things that were said during the exchange, we can see that the dialogue definitely fulfills its external function. It gives the audience a ton of plot-relevant information. Where it fails is that there is no reason for this conversation to be happening in-universe. Both Orm and Nereus demonstrate intimate knowledge of the subject matter being discussed, meaning that there is no reason for both of them to go into such lengthy detail. Think of it like this. I'm walking through a grocery store with a friend and we are looking for milk. Once we find some, we aren't going to stop to have a 2-minute conversation on the backstory of dairy. I know where milk comes from, he knows where milk comes from. We aren't going to talk about the history of lactation or the prerequisites of pasteurization. We're just gonna buy some milk. The same expectation should apply to Orm and Nereus. Since they are both already familiar with the topic, they would need to share dialogue about it. Instead of appearing as a realistic conversation between two characters, this dialogue comes off as a lecture specifically for the audience. And fantasy writers, pay close attention to this, because there is nothing that bores an audience faster than info-dumping exposition that they have no context for. Aquaman is a nearly 2.5-hour movie with dozens of opportunities to sprinkle in expository dialogue where it best fits organically, but yet it chose to deliver 3 full minutes of world building before the conflict of the narrative had even been established. The takeaway from this scene would be to closely look at your own writing and exposition and honestly ask yourself, is this the best place for this? Can I spread this info out more? Sure, it might take some effort on your part in rearranging your core plot lines, but readers and audiences should never feel like they're being told about your world. They should feel like they are experiencing it alongside your characters. Now, moving on, where that first scene had too much expository dialogue, this next scene we are going to look at actually has a lack of dialogue. Pay attention to how many words Tom says versus how many words Atlanta says. Here we go.
It's okay. You weren't breathing. I was gonna make you some eggs. Just don't eat my dog, okay? It's okay. It's okay. I made tea. Come on, try it. It'll make you better. So, who are you?
Atlanta. Queen of Atlantis.
Wow. I'm Tom. Keeper of Lighthouse.
Now, obviously, there is an imbalance in the dialogue. Tom speaks 10 times the amount of words that Atlanta does. One of the things we have talked about is the external function of dialogue, that being to convey plot-relevant information to the audience. Likewise, we have discussed that relevancy could be establishing setting, character details, rules of the world, or even just the tone of a scene. Interestingly enough though, a lack of dialogue can do much of the same thing and inform the audience of plot-relevant information. Think of Kimiko from The Boys or Spot from The Good Dinosaur, incidentally another terrible movie that I love. Both of these characters do not give dialogue, and that allows the audience to infer information about their character details and background. Far and away, a lack of dialogue creates a tone that signifies that a character is different, that they are a bit alien and unknown. Again, this works well with Kimiko and Spot because they are markedly different from the other characters within their respective narratives. Now, with this in mind, we can understand that the imbalance of dialogue between Tom and Atlanta is intentional, because the tone of the scene is striving to establish Atlanta as being alien and different. It's not just the dialogue either. Everything from the camera work to her actions and reactions paint her in a light of being a mysterious foreign entity from a world unknown to mankind. And to make sure we didn't miss that, Khal Drogo's voiceover spells it out for us word by word.
They were from different worlds.
But, and I can't emphasize this enough, this is stupid, because unlike Kimiko and Spot, there is no reason in-universe for Atlanta to not give dialogue. She is clearly fluent in English, as we see just moments later.
Atlanta. Queen of Atlantis.
Her tone-setting actions of destroying the TV and eating a live fish make her seem barbaric and animalistic. Even Tom talks to her like she is a Neanderthal.
I'm Tom. Keeper of Lighthouse.
The scene is a victim of the writers wanting to have their cake and eat it too. The movie wants to create this alien tension that surrounds Atlanta to show how Tom's love bridges the gap between their distant worlds, but then also wants to have Atlanta be aristocratic royalty from a highly advanced marine civilization. The entire premise of this scene is flawed from the ground up, because if Atlanta conversed with Tom, as an adult, like she should have, she and Tom would have realized, wow, we actually aren't different at all. Sure, they come from different places, but they are no more from separate worlds than a New Zealander is from a separate world than an Australian. The movie hangs its hat on this thesis that there is some great cavernous divide between Atlanteans and humans that Aquaman's sheer existence bridges to allow the two groups to coexist. But again, that divide only exists because the movie forces a lack of dialogue that conveniently creates this strange feral beast woman that magically falls in love with Tom. Basically, the movie wrote itself into a corner where either they had to kneecap Aquaman's character journey before he was ever born, or create a scene of pure Nicole Kidman-fueled nonsense to justify the conflict of a 2-hour film. The movie has the nerve to try to take this position of Atlanteans being so diametrically opposed and alien to humans when there are literal crab monsters and swamp things in the film. If Arthur's mother was a trench fiend or the Kraken, then a narrative based around Aquaman bridging a gap between the two species would be cooking with fire. But that's not what we get. The moral here, to draw this back to an editing perspective, is that it is impossible to not send messages to your audience and readers. Whether you include dialogue or choose not to, your audience will come to their own conclusions of information based on your decisions. Still though, it's up to you as a writer to meet your audience where you have led them, and to be aware of the choices you are making with your narrative. And even though we've only barely touched the surface of all the flaws in this movie, that is where this video is going to end. I hope I could be of just a little help to all of you people out there who want to get better at editing and writing. If you like what you've heard, you could be an absolutely amazing person and support the channel on Patreon. As always, it was a pleasure, and I will talk to you all again soon.